Ladies and gentlemen, I thought we'd do a rolling start. Thanks to all of you for finding your way. Oh, Elvis truly is in the building now. Colin's here. Thank you for finding your way to this session. For those of you that have an interest in identity and government, I'm really pleased to be part of a set of presentations that I think will we kind of bring you up to speed on the state of identity systems at scale that are importantly integrating government agencies as part of their work. We're going to start out in just a few minutes. We said we'd give folks a little bit more time to find us. But from my point of view, you've got a great opportunity here to hear about the current state of identity systems in 4 very different venues. Certainly, we'll be talking across experience that we've been involved in the US, in the UK, and in the state of Jersey. That would be Old Jersey, not New Jersey. You'll hear about that after us. But it's all about really the role of government in this evolving identity ecosystem. And the old world was that, in my opinion, the government really was at the center of identity systems, providing not just guidance, but strictures for how agencies would operate. As Mike Garcia said from the main stage just a few minutes ago, the NIST approach to 863 really is transformed in the last few years by engaging industry early and often in that regard. So I think 863 is a great example of a government agency contributing to an ongoing conversation that's a global conversation about identity. What my co-presenter Tom Smedinghoff and I will try and do is to talk a bit about how these pieces fit, these public and private identity systems and the governance around both of them, and how we might mesh them together to provide the near-term benefits that governments are looking for, which is reduced cost by investigating federated identity across agencies, but also increased economic growth by allowing for the private sector to innovate. That theme you'll hear in the presentations about Canada and the presentation about the states of Jersey, and then Chris will wrap it up as our cleanup hitter. So why don't Tom and I begin, and we're going to try and educate you about a term that you may have heard a lot, but don't quite have a handle on. So Tom Smedinghoff and I will try and do something very simple in 20 minutes, which is to give you as clear and operational definition of what a trust framework is. And why don't we get started? I'll introduce myself, and then Zach is going to be our curator for further conversations. My name's Don Thibeau. I'm the executive director of the OpenID Foundation, which is a standards development organization, and its sister organization is the Open Identity Exchange, where we focus on governance issues and the pesky issues around liability and how rulemaking can be shared across the public and private sector. But let's start. A trust framework. It turns out that everybody in this room has a trust framework in their pocket. It's probably best known and understood by the Visa and MasterCard system, which is a trust framework that allows the merchants, the financial institutions, the service providers, and you as a stakeholder an opportunity to participate in a system where the business, legal, and technical requirements are well understood. The great beauty of the trust framework that is represented by credit cards is that each of us, each of you, know in advance what your liability is, what your duties are as an actor, as a stakeholder in the system. We know that our liability is limited to something less than $100, and we know that our responsibility is to notify our credit card provider if we've lost or our card's been stolen. So that notion of having each of the stakeholders, each of the participants in a trust framework, having a very clear understanding of what their duties are, what their responsibilities are, what their liabilities are, is the key notion that we have here. The other notion that I'd like to share with you, which is one that is far less interesting for this audience and others, is this notion of governance. And really what our responsibilities are as architects, as project managers, as government agencies, is to try and synchronize what I call two sets of code bases. One is the technical code, the software code that's represented in standards. The other is legal code. And what we're trying to do in order to advance these systems is to synchronize these two code bases. So the first question is, why do we have a trust framework? There she is. Let's hear it for one of the participants of ZZ Off last night. She's moving very slow, but we're happy that she's here. Joni's going to be talking about one of the most successful trust frameworks, the Pan-Canadian Trust Frameworks, which gives you a real sense of the success path for these public and private sector systems. So why do we do trust frameworks? Well, turns out that bilateral contracts, its traditional method, is really great, is really well understood, but doesn't scale. It doesn't allow for the kind of agility that a loosely coupled set of service level agreements might provide on a global basis, nor does it give you the efficiency of a TOS, a Terms of Service Agreement, where we know with hopefully some understanding of the contract that we have between ourselves as a user, a customer as a citizen, and a set of service agreements. So we're going to talk again in our 20-minute slot here, again, the simple notion of what is a trust framework and how does it work. Again, the benefits of trust frameworks are that by nature they are interoperable. So in a global identity ecosystem or an ecosystem that involves federal, state, and local identity systems, interoperability is key. We also want to scale trust frameworks. What trust frameworks allow people to do is that well in advance of participating or signing up to a multi-party contract called trust frameworks, they can see in advance what their business, technical, and legal requirements are to be. The other thing is that trust frameworks can be trusted. And by that I mean the fact that their terms are transparent to all of the stakeholders in a system allows for greater trust at the scale that we're talking about. Lastly, the good news of a trust framework is that the opportunity cost to participate and the time to market for a highly scaled trust framework, that is one with lots of parties agreeing to the terms, comes very quickly. The bad news is that it requires you to make an upfront investment in articulating the business, legal, and technical requirements of that framework. So it's front-loaded in terms of the hard work, but it's highly scalable and low cost for those that join thereafter. The evolving definitions of trust frameworks, groups like Kantara, the US government, and others have been trying to define trust frameworks for quite some time. And so in the work that Tom and I have done with our colleague Esther Mackay, we've tried to take into consideration these various definitions of trust frameworks and come up with one that's, that we think is solid and provides the foundation that both the public and private sector can work on. So these are some of the models that we've talked about. They all fit a particular purpose, and we've tried to generalize that in an IETF-like structure. So I'm going to hand it over to one of the co-authors of the paper that we'll be talking about, Tom Smedinghoff, who is the leader of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Identity. And Tom's going to take you through, in very fast order, a quick representation of an extensive white paper that is now published this morning.
Thank you, Don. So I think we start with the basic premise that any multi-party system, whether it's a credit card system or an electronic payment system or an identity system, requires rules for a variety of reasons, simply to make it work so people know what they need to do and to sort of govern the operation of the system. Those rules are the trust framework. That's really what we're talking about here. And the trust framework really governs the whole identity system. So if you can think of it, all the details of any particular identity system are going to be governed pretty comprehensively by the trust framework. Whoops, let me back up for a second here. This is the definition that we've come up with, a very simple definition in terms of what is a trust framework. It's a legally enforceable set of specifications, rules, and agreements that govern an identity system. That's really all we're talking about. It's a set of rules, but of course there are lots of rules out there, but these rules govern a particular identity system and they are legally enforceable, and that's a key element. So let me focus on what we've come up with as sort of the basic characteristics of a trust framework. And I'll be going through these quite quickly, but just to give you a sense of how we define this animal, excuse me, and how it might be viewed. So we've identified these 7 characteristics of a trust framework, and I'll just briefly go through them. So the first characteristic is scope. And the key takeaway with respect to the scope of a trust framework is it defines and governs a particular identity system. So every identity system is going to have its own trust framework, just like every payment system or every credit card system has its own trust framework. So the scope is limited to a particular identity system. And as you can see by this example, which we'll get into a little bit more in detail later, we're going to have multiple trust frameworks because we have multiple identity systems, and each one needs some set of rules to govern its particular approach, just like Visa needs its rules and MasterCard needs its rules and American Express needs its rules. So what's the purpose of a trust framework? Well, basically the focus, as I said, it governs the operation of an identity system. It defines the rights and responsibilities of the parties, but basically for two basic reasons, which we call operational and trustworthiness. Whoops. Oh, I think we missed a slide here. Okay. But the basic purpose of a trust framework is first and foremost to make the identity system operational. It tells people what they need to do, how they need to do it, how they need to interact, what kind of specifications they should be following or standards, how they should format the data, all kinds of very basic issues, how identity proofing is going to be done, and so forth and so on, just to make it work, right? But then the second level of the purpose is to add a level of trust. Merely making it work is not necessarily good enough. We need to make it trustworthy for the particular purpose for which the identity system has been established. So we need a set of rules to do that. What's the form of a trust framework? Well, basically it's words on paper at the end of the day, and it can take a variety of forms. It can be a very long, comprehensive document. It can be multiple documents. It can incorporate, other standards and other documents, and so forth. So there's quite a variety of forms. And when we look at public systems versus private systems, we also have situations where private systems are typically going to be governed by trust frameworks that take the form of a contractual document where parties agree to be bound contractually. Public systems may use a contractual document, or they may adopt a statute or a regulation like we've seen in some of the country identity systems, like, for example, in Estonia, where the legal rules adopted by the government comprise the trust framework. What's the content of a trust framework? And it really focuses on a couple of things. One is role definition. What roles are going to be considered important for this particular trust framework? How are we going to define those roles? And what's the responsibility of the parties? From an operational perspective, we need one or more roles to really govern the identity system and to manage the trust framework document itself, sort of like the Visa organization does for the credit card system. And then we have a number of participating roles, and we need to define those. Just like in the credit card model, we have issuing banks and merchants and cardholders and processors and a variety of different roles. So we need to define those within the trust framework, and this slide just sort of gives you a sense of the division there between operational roles, which are more at the governing level, and then participating roles, which really are the entities that are using the trust framework and benefiting from the transactions that it governs. But related to that, the $64,000 question is, well, what goes into a trust framework? What's the content? What are the issues that it focuses on? So basically, we've listed kind of 4 general categories, although these overlap quite significantly. But we need business rules, we need technical rules, we need operational rules, and we need rules to address the legal issues that come up in the context of governing a trust framework. Now, all of these things kind of overlap, so it's not necessarily a clean division, but these are the kinds of things that we need to address. And on this slide, we've just given you some examples of the types of issues you might address in a trust framework. What needs to be addressed for any particular trust framework and how much detail is required, of course, is going to vary from one trust framework to another. And this is kind of really the next project that we're looking at doing in conjunction with OIX, is to really come up with a document that defines what goes into a trust framework, what's the taxonomy of issues, how do you really develop a trust framework and make it work. So that's sort of, stay tuned, that's going to be the next white paper. This one is more at the definitional level. Who writes a trust framework? Who controls it? Who updates it? Again, that's a decision that's going to be made from one identity system to another. If we look at the credit card model, you've got a separate organization at the top like Visa Corporation or Visa Inc., whatever they are. They are the entity responsible for writing and updating the trust framework that governs the credit card system. The same thing could certainly be done with respect to an identity system, or there's other models as well. It might be one of the parties within the system, perhaps the entity that started the system. Like if you look at the Facebook or Google systems, those trust frameworks are obviously written by that controlling entity. You could also have a situation where members within the context of a trust framework form a committee. Or some sort of group that is responsible for updating and maintaining the trust framework. But the bottom line is somebody needs to do it. And then we have the question of enforceability, and there we're looking at, in order to really comprise a valid trust framework and to be effective, it has to be enforceable. In the private identity system context, that's typically done by contracts. In the public system, as I mentioned, that could be done by contract or by statute or regulation. But when we look at the sort of the legal framework that governs trust frameworks, this is in a sense what we have. In the background, we have general commercial law that kind of is out there and governs as a default. Then we might have identity management law like we have in Virginia, that's new. And then within the context of that, we have the individual trust frameworks. And finally, liability. Trust frameworks offer the parties the possibility of defining liability amongst themselves as they agree, as opposed to leaving it to chance and the problems of existing law and the vagueness of existing law. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. So again, the specifics of this system that Tom's been describing can be found in a white paper that we published today. As a matter of fact, there's been a series of white papers that Open Identity Exchange has developed over the years. We started 10 years ago trying to do exactly what we're doing now. we've learned a little bit since then. As Tom mentioned, we've also tried to take on the L word, liability. If you want to stop a conversation about identity systems, mention the word liability. The other thing that we've talked about in white papers is trust marks, which are an important consideration of many trust frameworks. So as I mentioned, the paper that we've discussed is now out today. The next will be a recipe. It will be specific guidance for how a community of interest can develop a trust framework. In addition to that, we'll be talking about attribute exchange in an upcoming white paper as well. Also, we're going to be talking about the role of self-certification in a trust framework. And then, and most importantly, we're going to be applying it and sharing that information with communities of experts, public policy experts at places like the World Bank, and we mentioned earlier at the American Bar Association. One of the most important things happening in the identity ecosystem is the financial API standard that will be developed in particular for the Open Banking Institute in the Open Banking Working Group Limited in the UK. So trust frameworks are critical to the banking industry, not only in the UK, but in anticipation of the PS2 requirements in Europe. Also, we're conducting a series of workshops, and we'll have a case study for the International Airline Transport Association. These are all the airlines, airports, and other authorities that have to figure out a set of rules and tools, business, legal, and requirements for air travel to be more secure, more privacy protecting, and easy to use. We'll also, over the course of the summer, be working with the Shared Signals group and the OpenID Foundation. How can a gang of competitors share information for security purposes, and also synthetic identities between and among data aggregators? So trust frameworks have really come into their own. They're real-world challenges by these and other organizations. And lastly, we at OIX are building a registry, a trusted place for trust frameworks, where we take no judgment, but we collect in one place trust frameworks that can be analyzed side by side by side. This will be greatly helped by an inventory of global trust frameworks, trust lists, and other trust contracts that we've done an inventory of and will be publishing in a white paper. So we hope that that this has given you, again, a notion of the hard work to make something simple. And the simple thing that we're trying to do is to have a solid operational definition of a trust framework. You'll be hearing about in the next presentation some of the work that's been done in the states of Jersey, where they will be trying to extend the trust framework that the UK, I'm going to vamp a bit while you come up here, Marcus, and plug in. We're a real-world challenge of how do you extend a trust framework developed in Great Britain to the states of Jersey in the Channel Islands.
While he's getting set up, let me just mention, everything we went through quite quickly this morning is available in the white paper that I guess just got posted on the OIX. It was published today, okay. So if you take a look at that white paper, it will give you a little more detail on everything that we talked about this morning.
We want to do some questions on if there are people that have some questions. Sure. There you go, Steve.
How could you tell? I'm Steve Wilson from Constellation Research. Great work, guys. I want to, maybe for another time, but at least flag the need to talk more about interoperability. I think it's a word that slips off the tongue and is taken for granted, and the things that come to mind, I think we'll find from person to person varies really markedly. And so my classic example is, you know, you mentioned Visa, MasterCard yourselves. Obviously it interoperates at the level that I can stick any Visa card into almost any ATM these days and get money in almost any currency, which is great. But if I've got an Amex card and I go to a merchant who doesn't accept Amex, then there's no interoperability, even though their system is perfectly able to read, track 2 of the mag stripe or the chip card. And then when it comes to interoperability, I think of identity, I think we need to be super, super careful about interoperability. And I think that maybe the term is almost misleading. Like, what does it mean for an Australian identity to be recognised or interoperate or something somewhere? I mean, I don't even know what it means. So I think at different levels, we can talk about interoperability technically and semantically and in terms of business rules, but I think we need to be careful to not put the word out there and just let it hang there and let people interpret it how they like.
I think that's a great point. It's this notion of what's interoperability and what's integration. And if you look at the kind of systems that Marcus and Joni will be talking about, they are, how do we provide for a state or a province to develop their own identity system with their own choices around business, legal, and technical requirements, yet provide for the interoperability of that state, province, or local government with a federal and then a global ecosystem. So I think you're right. Once you get one definition done, it causes you to do the other things around it. And certainly the difference and nuances between integration and interoperability are key to understanding the value of a trust framework.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but there's this term called detrimental reliance. Now, if you issue an identity, let's just take the existing, where we are today, Google and Facebook, you can log in with, right? So what happens by default? Is Google somehow reliable if somebody relies on that as a real identity? Is there any sort of, where are we starting with? I guess that's my question.
And just a quick comment, that's a question that should, and I'm sure is, answered by the quote-unquote trust framework that Google or Facebook have. And I'm sure that trust framework says that they have no liability. We give you what we've got, use it for whatever it's worth. But those are very low-level systems, right? If you're talking about identity in the context of something that's much more significant, then that liability question becomes much more significant. And you've got two choices. One is you can think it through in advance and define in the trust framework how that liability rule should play out, or you can ignore it in the trust framework and then just leave it to general law, of which nobody really knows how general law would solve that problem. And so that's the big risk. And so that's where trust frameworks can really, I think, play an important role, is allow the parties to think that through in advance and make some risk allocations among them.
Can I ask one more follow-up if the mic helps?
Yeah, so what would seem to be the ideal is government-issued IDs, driver's license. We're relying on those. But at some point to be able, okay, we have an identity, it's you, and we have a digital identity, but we somehow lay this onto the government because that's really what we're relying on. We're relying on the driver's license, this sort of thing that's government-issued ID. Is there, in your view, a way to set that up so that we all understand if the driver's license faked, it's the government issue. It's a government issue. It's not a identity issue.
Well, sure. You can, and again, this goes back to the trust framework. In a private sector trust framework, you could identify a scheme where I'm issuing identities based on driver's licenses, let's say. And we could either have a rule that says I'm liable if that identity is bad, regardless of whether the driver's license was bad or not. Or we can set up a rule that says, for example, I'm giving you what's in the driver's license I looked at. You take the risk that the driver's license is any good. Again, you've got a choice. But from the government's perspective, of course, they're not taking any liability for the credentials that they issue. We just rely on them because we think the government is trustworthy when it issues driver's licenses and passports. I think it's what it comes down to.